At a time in the 1880s, with large coffee farms in the interior of the state of São Paulo, slave labor predominated for the work of farmers who cultivated the black pearl in their coffee plantations. Among the coffee barons, Viscount Francisco da Cunha Bueno stands out. The young potter Seca was one of his slaves. It was there where the Viscount had the idea of imposing on the boy, due to his athletic build, the role of human reproduction for his slaves. By doing so, the farmer would have new slaves, just as he could do with his breeding male animals. In fact, the coffee plantation owner's objective was to continue having slaves without paying, since there were signs of a prohibition on the importation of new slaves from Africa. Between 1501 and 1870, statistics show that more than 12.5 million Africans were sold as slaves in the Americas. Of that total, approximately 4.8 million slaves, until just over the second half of the 19th century, remained in Brazil to work in the cultivation of coffee, in cities such as São Carlos. The São Carlos region emerged precisely from coffee development in 1857. It was in this city, 200 kilometers from Sorocaba, where coffee exports brought wealth to its slave colonels in more than 3 centuries of slavery. Today, studies attest that São Carlos was the second largest city to house slaves on its coffee plantations in the state of São Paulo. Fortunately, on May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel decreed the end of slavery in Brazil. Roque José Florencio, slave of a landowner on the outskirts of São Carlos, in the interior of São Paulo, would have been born in the first half of the century. 19 and died, according to his death certificate, in 1958. Declared a reproductive slave due to his physical size, considered ideal for producing children suitable for forced labor. He would be the father of 200 children and direct ancestor of 30% of the population of the town of the rural area of Santa Eudaxia. The story is told by one of his granddaughters, Maria Madalena Florencio Florentino, in an interview with G1 Florencio, whose long and thin hands earned him the nickname Potter Seca, was bought by the landowner Francisco da Cunha Bueno at a fair in the then town from Sorocaba. Potter Seca did not work on the farm, nor did he live in the slave quarter. He had good relations with his owner and was responsible for traveling the 35 kilometers that separate the rural village from the city of São Carlos on horseback every day to collect the mail, in addition to taking care of the other transport animals on the farm. At the time, however, there was a myth that tall men with thin shins would be more likely to have male children, a profitable superstition in the long and cruel years of slavery in Brazil. Standing to 0.18 meters tall, Florencio was designated a breeding slave, and was forced to visit the slave quarters regularly to rape the women. It is estimated that 30% of the population of the district of Santa Eudaxia today are descendants of Potter Seca, who would have around 200 unregistered children. It was through the messenger service that he met Palmira, a girl from the city who proposed marriage, put on the animal's back and took it to the farm. The newlyweds received 20 bushels of land from the farm owner, on which they built a house and had 9 children. Without money to fence the land, they lost part of it to their neighbors. In the remaining space, Florencio raised chickens and sold eggs, planted cassava and zucchini, and produced household items that he sold nearby until his death in 1958. To come into the world as a slave, Potter Seca would have to have been born before 1871, when the Free Womb Law was signed. Apparently, he was born in the first half of the 19th century and lived for 130 years. Psychologist Marinaldo Fernando de Souza, doctor in education from the Universidade Estadual Paulista UNESP, told G1 that official history tends to force the oblivion of black memory. In Santa Eudaxia, there is a history to be explored, to be told, and which is relegated to a status of lesser value, said he, who addressed the story in his doctoral thesis. Psychologist Marinaldo Fernando de Souza, doctor in education from the Universidade Estadual Paulista UNESP, told G1 that official history tends to force the oblivion of black memory. In Santa Eudaxia, there is a history to be explored, to be told, and which is relegated to a status of lesser value, said he, who addressed the story in his doctoral thesis. For the researcher, Florencio's presence may explain how the number of slaves in the region continue to rise even after the promulgation of the Eusebio de Quiro's law, which prevented the slave trade from Africa across the Atlantic in 1850. If he were white, he wouldn't be a legend. He's real. He was enslaved, commented the researcher. This history needs to be rescued and does not need documents. The documents are forged in favor of the white elite. Black memory needs to come to light. Due to his physical size and the beliefs of the time, Roque Jose Florencio was declared a breeding slave. He was 2.18 meters tall and, at that time, there was a myth that men who were tall and had thin shins were more likely to father sons. Hence the choice, after all. Its fruits would be a workforce extremely suitable for forced labor in the countryside. Forced to visit the slave quarters regularly to rape the women who were there, he would have had more than 200 children, being the direct predecessor of 30% of the population from the village of Santa Eudaxia. In addition to the physical characteristics already mentioned, he also had long, thin hands, which earned him the nickname Seca. Another curious fact about the slave is that he did not work on the farm, nor did he live in the slave quarters. Quite the contrary, his status as a breeding slave gave him some perks. Furthermore, Florencio also had a good relationship with Cunha Bueno and, thus, was responsible for taking care of the farm's transport animals. Furthermore, he was tasked with traveling more than 30 kilometers on horseback every day to collect his master's correspondence. In fact, it was through this messaging service that he met Palmira, a girl from the city who he married. On the back of the horse, she was taken to Francisco's farm. Arriving there, the farmer gave them 20 acres of land, where they built a house and had 9 children. Despite having possession, they did not have enough money to fence the land. As a result, they lost part of the lot to their neighbors. However, this did not stop Roque Jose from raising chickens and selling their eggs. He cultivated cassava and zucchini, and produced house.